After 35 years of marriage, my husband came home and, with a calm smile, told me he had found the love of his life. Just like that. No hesitation. While I was making dinner as I had done for 3 decades, he explained that she was different from me. That she was humble and simple. That material things did not matter to her the way, according to him, they mattered to me. I looked at him in silence. I set the ladle down on the stove and smiled without saying a word. Then I turned toward my personal assistant, who was reviewing some documents in the living room. Yes, I have a personal assistant. Something my dear husband seemed to have very conveniently forgotten. With a calmness that surprised even me, I gave her the instructions. Freeze the joint accounts, cancel Mrs. Margaret's private health insurance, and change every password. The look on Richard's face in that moment is something I will never forget. It was the pure confusion of a man who believed he could replace me as easily as changing a pair of old socks. But that was only the beginning. What my husband did not know, what none of them knew, was who I truly am. They also had no idea what I am capable of when I am underestimated. Follow my story until the end and tell me in the comments what city you are watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 68 years old, and for most of my adult life I have been the perfect wife, the devoted daughter-in-law, the woman who sacrificed everything for a family that, over time, proved it did not deserve it. I met Richard when I was only 33. At the time, I was working as an accountant at a well-known financial firm in Austin, Texas. I had my own apartment, my own car, and an independent life. I was the first woman in my family to earn a university degree. My father, may he rest in peace, was deeply proud of that. Richard was charming in those years. He worked in sales, always well-dressed, always wearing that smile that made you feel like the only woman in the world. He courted me for 6 months before I agreed to marry him. My mother warned me. She told me that a man so attractive and so smooth with words could bring trouble. But I was in love, or at least I thought I was. We were married in a beautiful ceremony at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church. I remember that day with a strange mix of nostalgia and regret. I wore the wedding dress that had belonged to my grandmother, with lace brought from France. Richard cried when he saw me walk down the aisle. He swore to love and respect me every day of his life. The first years were good, I will not deny that. We both worked. We built a life together. We bought our first home, modest but welcoming, in a suburban neighborhood in Austin. But then Mrs. Margaret came to live with us. Richard's mother. From the very first day, she made it clear that I would never be good enough for her son. Richard was an only child, the spoiled one, the one who could never do anything wrong. When his father died and she was left without a pension or savings, the responsibility of caring for her fell on us. Or rather, on me. Richard continued working and traveling across the country for his sales job, while I became Mrs. Margaret's nurse, cook, and maid. I left my job. Richard said it would be temporary. That his mother needed special care after the depression that followed her husband's death. That temporary arrangement turned into 30 years. 30 years caring for a woman who never had a real medical diagnosis, but who became an expert at manipulating her son with imaginary ailments. 30 years of hearing that the food was never as good as the way she made it. That I cleaned poorly. That I dressed inappropriately. That I had never given grandchildren to her poor Richard. As yes, we could not have children. After years of trying and painful treatments, we learned that I could not conceive. Mrs. Margaret made sure I never forgot that, according to her, I had failed at my most important duty as a woman. And Richard, my dear Richard, never defended me even once in all those years. Even so, I continued to be the perfect wife. I managed the household, cared for Mrs. Margaret, and kept everything spotless for when Richard returned from his business trips. Over time, those trips became longer and more frequent. 1 week in Dallas, 2 weeks in San Antonio, an entire month in the border region of Texas. I stayed behind alone with his mother, listening to her endless complaints, watching my youth slip away between her demands and whims. Richard would return tired and stressed, and I made sure everything was perfect for him. His favorite meals. His clothes ironed exactly the way he liked them. The house silent so he could rest. I never complained. I never confronted him about the lonely nights, The birthdays he spent away, the anniversaries he forgot. I was the understanding wife. The one who believed he worked hard for us. The years passed and I slowly became invisible. At 45, I looked at myself in the mirror and no longer recognized the independent woman I once was. My hair began to turn gray. My body showed the marks of time and stress. I stopped getting dressed up, stopped caring about looking attractive. Why bother? Richard was almost never home, and when he was, he barely looked at me. Mrs. Margaret, of course, never missed a chance to point out how much I had let myself go. She said her Richard deserved a wife who took better care of herself. The irony was that everything had always been under my control. The household accounts, Mrs. Margaret's medical expenses, which were high despite her good health for years, and the investments we made with the money Richard earned. He never had a head for numbers. He was always a charismatic, charming salesman, but terrible with finances. That responsibility also landed on my shoulders, and I carried it the same way I carried everything else. 5 years ago, Mrs. Margaret began to show real signs of decline. 87 years of bitterness finally took their toll. She needed more care, more attention. I hired nurses, but she dismissed every single one of them. She claimed that no one cared for her the way I did. Richard insisted that I was the only one who could make his mother happy, and I, naive as I was, kept sacrificing myself. My own health problems began around then. High blood pressure, insomnia, constant back pain from lifting her again and again. But my ailments did not matter. I was the strong one, the one who could always handle everything. And that was when the strange details began. Richard, who had once been careless about his appearance, started paying attention to how he looked. He bought new clothes without consulting me, something he had never done before. He started going to the gym. He changed his cologne. When I asked him about it, he said it was for work. That he needed to look good for clients. I wanted to believe him. Then the messages began. His phone, which he used to leave lying around the house, now stayed with him at all times, even in the bathroom. He smiled when he looked at it. He typed quickly and put it away when I came near. One night while he was sleeping, I checked his phone. I am not proud of having done that, but something inside me told me I needed to know. There they were, hundreds of messages with a woman named Melissa. My love, my darling, I cannot wait to see you. Photos of them together in restaurants, in hotels, in places I only knew from pictures. She was young, probably around 40, attractive in an ordinary, easily found way. She wore tight clothes and heavy makeup. She took filtered photos like so many women on social media. In those messages, Richard was a different man. Romantic, attentive, passionate. Everything he had stopped being with me decades earlier. He wrote her beautiful words, bought her gifts, planned romantic getaways. All of it with the money I managed. Money I had learned to grow over the years. I closed the phone and put it back where it belonged. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. Confront him. Yell at him. Throw the 35 years I had given him in his face. But something stopped me. An inner voice told me to wait. To watch. To understand exactly what was happening before acting. So I became a detective. I began paying attention to every detail. His schedules. His excuses. His spending. Richard had never been particularly clever. Following his trail was easy. Melissa worked as a receptionist at one of the hotels where he stayed frequently. That was where they had met. She was divorced and had 2 teenage children. She lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. Richard played the role of her Prince Charming, the successful man who rescued her from her ordinary life. For months I kept up the charade. I remained the perfect wife while Richard lived a double life. The most painful part was not the romantic messages or the photos. It was reading how he talked about me to her. He called me a bitter old woman. He said his wife was only useful for taking care of his mother. That I was a woman without passion, without a life. He told her I was boring, that I never wanted a social life, that I had become a hermit. He conveniently left out the fact that it was he who asked me to leave my job, distance myself from my friends, and devote myself entirely to his mother. He also told Melissa that I was materialistic. That I only cared about money and appearances. Me who had spent 30 years living according to the needs of others. Me who never bought anything luxurious and wore the same clothes for years to save money. Me materialistic. The irony would have been funny if it had not been so tragic. But what hurt the most was reading that they were planning a future together. Richard promised her that he would divorce me soon. He said he was only waiting for his mother to die, because I was the only one who could take care of her. After that, he would be free. They would get married, travel, live the life they believed they deserved. Everything was planned with a coldness that made my blood run cold. To him, I did not count as a person. I was an obstacle. A convenient employee he could discard once he no longer needed me. And then that afternoon came. Richard arrived home earlier than usual. Mrs. Margaret was taking her afternoon nap. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. He sat down at the table, looked at me, and with the same smile that once made me fall in love, said the words that changed everything. He said he had found the woman of his life. He said it as if he were sharing good news. As if I were his friend or his confidant. Not his wife of 35 years. Then he explained in detail that Melissa was special. That she was humble and simple. That material things did not matter to her the way, according to him, they mattered to me. That she made him feel alive again. That he would understand if I was upset, but that this was true love and that he deserved to be happy. I listened in silence while something inside me broke and at the same time began to rebuild. I looked at him closely, perhaps for the first time in many years. I saw a 68-year-old man who still believed himself to be a ladies' man. A man convinced that a woman 20 years younger was in love with him and not with his wallet. I saw someone who had used me for decades and was now discarding me without hesitation like an old rag. I saw a man who had no idea who he was speaking to because Richard never truly knew who I was. He never asked about my life before meeting him. He never showed interest in my properties or in the inheritance my father left me. He assumed that when I left my job I became completely dependent on him. He never carefully reviewed the documents he signed. He trusted blindly that I handled his money, and I did. I certainly did. But I also managed my own, the money he never knew existed. My father died 15 years ago. He was a successful businessman, the owner of several properties in areas that were not worth much at the time, but that later became highly valuable parts of the city. He left everything to me, his only daughter. Land, buildings, investments. A fortune I always kept separate from Richard in accounts and trusts under my name. When I got married, my father, a wise and cautious man, made sure I signed a prenuptial agreement that protected my assets. Richard signed it without reading, eager to get married. Legal details never mattered to him. All those years, while Richard believed we lived solely on his salary as a salesman, I multiplied my father's fortune. I invested in real estate, in the financial market, and in small businesses that grew over time. I hired financial advisors, attorneys, and accountants. I built a silent empire that Richard never imagined. The house we lived in, the one he thought we had bought together, was actually in my name. The investments he believed were joint were mine. I allowed him to think he contributed the same, that he was the provider, the man of the house. But reality was very different. That is why, when he told me he had found the love of his life, when I saw that arrogant smile expecting me to cry or beg, something inside me clicked. I turned toward Laura, my personal assistant and legal advisor, who happened to be at the house that day helping me review some documents, and gave her the instructions. To freeze all the joint accounts. To cancel Mrs. Margaret's private health insurance. To change every single password. Laura, always professional, nodded without a word and began making calls. Richard's face changed completely. He asked what accounts, what I was doing. I smiled. It was that calm smile I had perfected after years of swallowing humiliation. With a calmness that surprised even me, I explained that the accounts holding all the money he believed belonged to both of us, were actually under my name. That the house was mine. That the car he drove was registered in my name. That his mother's premium private health insurance, the one that allowed her to have private nurses and imported medication, was paid by me from my personal account. Richard turned pale. He started shouting that it was impossible, that he had worked his entire life, that the money belonged to both of us. I asked Laura to show him the documents. Everything was there, clear and undeniable in black and white. His name did not appear on anything that truly mattered. For 35 years he signed everything I put in front of him without reading a single line. He always said he trusted me. What an irony. He shouted that I could not do this to him, that I was crazy. I calmly replied that I could do exactly what I wanted with my money and with my property. I told him that if he wanted to leave with the woman of his life, he was free to do so. But he would leave with what truly belonged to him, which was practically nothing. His salary as a salesman, which was not nearly as impressive as he had made Melissa believe, was all he had. Everything else, the house, the cars, the investments, the savings accounts, all of it was mine. But I had no intention of showing all my cards just yet. I needed Richard to believe he still had some power left, some option. I wanted to see how he would react. So after the initial shock, after watching him stammer and make threats, I softened my tone slightly. I told him that maybe I was reacting too strongly out of surprise. That I needed time to process everything. That perhaps we could talk calmly in a few days. Richard, desperate to believe there was still a way out, agreed. He left the house that night, supposedly to stay at a hotel. But I knew he would run straight into Melissa's arms, and that is exactly what he did. I knew because of my own resources. Yes, weeks earlier I had also hired a private investigator. I learned that he arrived at her apartment completely shaken. He told her everything. That his wife was crazy. That she had frozen the accounts. That she was being irrational. That it was all temporary. He promised her that everything would be resolved and that soon they would be together with all the money he believed belonged to him through the marriage. Poor Melissa. She, who thought she had caught a rich man, suddenly found herself with a 68-year-old man without a single dollar to his name. The investigators' reports were almost comical. Melissa began to pressure him. She needed him to fix the situation as soon as possible because she had expenses. Her children needed things. The romance evaporated the moment the money stopped flowing. Richard tried to use his credit cards without success. He realized that he had no access to any money at all. He called Laura, trying to intimidate her with threats of attorneys. She, with her impeccable professionalism, explained that everything was in perfect legal order and that any attempt to claim what did not belong to him would be met with the full force of the law. Meanwhile, I continued with my life as usual. I took care of Mrs. Margaret, who was scandalized by the situation, though not enough to defend me. I kept the house spotless and, at night when everyone was asleep, I worked on my plan. I hired the best divorce attorneys in the city. I gathered evidence of Richard's infidelity. I did not need it from a legal standpoint because everything was in my name, but I wanted it. I documented every dollar he had spent on Melissa. Every gift, every dinner, every night at a hotel. All of it came from the joint accounts I managed, so in practice I had used my own money to support his mistress. I reviewed every document we had signed during our long marriage. The prenuptial agreement was still valid and ironclad. Nothing I had brought into the marriage, nor anything I had earned during those years, belonged to him. In our country there are marital property laws, but we had married under a separation of assets at my father's insistence. Richard signed eagerly without understanding the implications. I contacted my financial advisors and asked them for a complete report of my estate. The numbers were impressive even to me. The properties I inherited from my father were now worth 20 times more. My investments had grown exponentially. I owned several profitable businesses. I was not just rich. I was very rich. And Richard had no idea. I also investigated Melissa thoroughly. It turned out that the humble, simple woman who supposedly did not care about material things had significant debts, maxed out credit cards, personal loans, and even overdue rent. She had been using Richard as her emergency exit from her financial problems. The gifts he gave her she sold. The money he handed over to help with her children went toward paying debts. She was no more in love with him than he was with her. Everything was a transaction, and both of them were naive enough not to see it. Laura suggested that I proceed with the divorce and close everything quickly. I could have it resolved in a matter of weeks. But I did not want to rush. I wanted Richard to truly understand what he had lost. I wanted Melissa to see the reality of her penniless Prince Charming. I wanted Mrs. Margaret to experience what it meant to live without me taking care of her. So I waited. I let the weeks pass. Richard tried to come back home several times. He arrived with flowers bought with who knows what money and carefully rehearsed apologies. He said he had been a fool, that Melissa meant nothing, that I was the love of his life. I listened with that same calm smile. I offered him coffee and we sat down to talk like old acquaintances. He believed that little by little he was convincing me that I would eventually give in. He did not know that every visit was being recorded by the security cameras I had discreetly installed in the house. He also did not know that every promise he made to me and later broke when he went back to Melissa was being documented. I let him believe he still had hope. Meanwhile, Mrs. Margaret grew worse. Without her premium private health insurance, she depended on the public system. The nurses stopped coming to the house. Imported medications were replaced with generic ones. She was furious and outraged. She blamed me as always. But she also began to blame Richard. She wondered where her son was. Why he was not fixing the situation. Why he had abandoned her. Richard tried to take care of her for a few nights. He lasted exactly 3 days before realizing how exhausting it was. 3 days of what I had done for 30 years. Melissa also began to show her true character. With no money circulating, the fights between them became constant. The private investigator reported shouting and accusations. She called him useless and a liar. He accused her of being interested like all the others. Eternal love lasted less than 2 months without financial support. I watched everything the way one watches a soap opera, with the difference that this was my life and I controlled the script. I began going out more. I got dressed up, went to the hair salon, bought myself new clothes. Laura convinced me to join a private circle of businesswomen. There I met incredible women. Strong, independent women. Women who had built empires, who traveled alone, and who lived life by their own rules. I realized everything I had missed while locked inside that house, caring for a manipulative mother-in-law and an ungrateful husband. One of the women in the group, Susan, became my friend. She was 72 and had just returned from a trip to Europe. She showed me photos of Paris, Rome, and Barcelona, places I only knew from magazines. And she said something that stayed with me forever. Evelyn, life does not end at 60. Sometimes it barely begins if you dare to live it. Those words echoed inside me. I understood that I had spent decades of merely surviving, not living. I had been the perfect wife, the devoted daughter-in-law, the silent martyr. And for what? So that a mediocre man could replace me with the first woman who paid him attention, and so that a bitter mother-in-law would never acknowledge any of my sacrifices. To wake up at 68 feeling used and discarded. But that Evelyn was dying. A new Evelyn was being born. One who knew her worth, who knew exactly what she was worth and what she deserved. And that new Evelyn was not going to settle for simply getting divorced. She was going to make sure everyone learned a lesson. I hired a publicist. Yes, exactly as it sounds. I asked him to organize an event, a charity dinner to raise funds for the public nursing home in Austin, Texas. I rented the Grand Hall. I invited influential people, business leaders, politicians, and artists. I made sure the press would be there, and of course, I invited Richard and Mrs. Margaret. Richard was confused but flattered. He thought it was my way of showing him that we were still an important couple, that I was reconsidering everything. Mrs. Margaret, vain as ever, could not resist the idea of mingling with influential people. What neither of them knew was that night I would reveal exactly who Evelyn Harper was, not as anyone's wife, but as the heir to one of the most respected names in the city's real estate sector. That night I would show my fortune, my achievements, and my true identity, the one I had kept hidden for decades behind the role of a submissive wife. The night of the event arrived. I looked spectacular. I went to the best beauty salon in the city. My hair, which I had allowed to turn gray naturally, now had an elegant, modern cut. I wore a designer dress that Laura helped me choose. Jewelry that had belonged to my mother. Heels I had not worn in years. When I arrived at the event, many heads turned. Richard was already there, uncomfortable, wearing a suit that looked cheap compared to the others. Mrs. Margaret was sitting in a wheelchair she did not actually need, but used to evoke sympathy. The look on Richard's face when he saw me was one of complete astonishment. He did not recognize me. I approached with a wide smile. He tried to take my arm and pretend we were a happy married couple. I gently pulled away and went to greet the other guests, leaving him standing there, alone and disoriented. The dinner went on normally. Good food, pleasant conversations. Richard tried to participate, but it was obvious he was out of place. These were real business people, people with money and power. He was nothing more than a middle-class salesman who had believed himself far more important than he truly was. The moment for the speeches arrived. The event host, an old friend of my father who had known me since I was a child, took the microphone. He thanked everyone for attending and began to speak about me. He said that everyone was there that night thanks to the generosity of an extraordinary woman. A woman who had chosen to work in silence. A woman who had built an empire while keeping a low profile. He said that that night, that woman had decided to step out of the shadows and take the place that rightfully belonged to her as a business leader. Then he introduced me as Evelyn Harper, president of Harper Real Estate Development Group, one of the wealthiest women in the city. The room erupted in applause. I stood up and walked toward the podium. I did not look at Richard, but I could feel his shock from across the room. I took the microphone and thanked everyone for being there. I spoke about my father, about how he taught me the value of hard work and the importance of helping others. I talked about the projects my company was developing, about investments in the community, and about future plans. On a giant screen, they displayed my portfolio of properties, buildings, land, and commercial developments. Each image represented entire fortunes. I spoke about investments in technology, in successful startup companies, and in sustainable projects. The figures impressed even an audience accustomed to money. And only then did I mention my personal life. I explained that for 35 years I had chosen to keep my professional life separate from my married life. That I had chosen to be only a wife and a daughter-in-law, while no one knew about my business achievements. But that now, in this new stage, I had decided to be completely myself. I looked directly at Richard when I said that sometimes we dedicate our lives to people who never valued our sacrifices. People who saw us as servants and not as partners. People who believed that without them we were nothing. But the truth always comes out. And the truth was that I never needed them. They needed me. The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone understood perfectly who I was referring to. Richard was pale as paper. Mrs. Margaret sat there with her mouth open. Then I announced that that night I would donate $250,000 to the public nursing home in Austin, Texas. It was more than Richard had earned in the last 5 years we were together. The applause was deafening. After the speech, many people approached me. Business leaders interested in partnerships, journalists asking for interviews, and people who simply wanted to know my story. Richard tried to approach me several times, but there was always someone more important speaking with me. Finally, when the event was coming to an end, he stood in front of me. He said we needed to talk, his voice trembling. I replied with a smile that of course we would. That the next day at 10 in the morning at my office, Laura would send him the address. For the first time in 35 years, I was the one setting the terms. I decided when, where, and how we would speak. Richard nodded, defeated, and left with Mrs. Margaret, who did not stop throwing hateful looks my way. That night I slept better than I had in years. The next morning Richard arrived on time at my office. My offices, I should say, because they occupied an entire floor of the corporate office tower in the downtown business district. He had never been there before. He never knew they existed. He walked in nervously, taking in the designer furniture, the original artwork, and the panoramic views of the city. Laura greeted him with cold politeness and led him to my private office. I was sitting behind my imported mahogany desk, reviewing documents. I let him wait a few minutes before looking up. I wished Richard good morning and asked him to sit down. He took the chair across from me, looking small and out of place. He began to say my name, but I raised my hand and asked him to let me speak first. I told him I had prepared something for him. Laura came in and handed him a folder. I asked him to open it. Richard did so with trembling hands. Inside were the divorce papers ready to be signed. There was also a complete inventory of the marital assets, clearly showing that everything was in my name. There were photographs of him with Melissa, account statements showing the money spent on her, hotel records, and messages. But that was not all. There was also an envelope. I asked him to open it. Inside was a check for the exact amount of what he had earned and contributed to the household during a marriage that lasted decades. I had calculated it dollar for dollar. I explained that it was his money. What he had worked for and earned honestly. It was his and it belonged to him. I never intended to take away what he had truly earned. He looked at the check. For an average person it was a significant amount, but compared to my fortune it was insignificant. I told him that everything else, the house, the cars, and the investments had always been mine. I reminded him that he had signed a prenuptial agreement under a separation of assets and that he had no right to anything that was mine. He tried to speak, but I was not finished. I made it clear that Mrs. Margaret was no longer my responsibility. That if he wanted to keep her private health insurance he could pay for it with his own money. That if his mother wanted to stay in the house, which was my property, she would have to pay rent. Or she could go live with him wherever that might be. I told him that I knew he was staying with Melissa. His face turned red. Then I informed him that I had something else for him. Laura came back in with another folder. It contained the complete report from the private investigator on Melissa. Her debts, her lies, and the evidence that she was also seeing another man, younger and with more money, while she was involved with Richard. Richard read the report and I watched him fall apart. His great love, the humble and simple woman, was just as opportunistic and dishonest as he was. The irony was obvious. I then explained what would happen next. That he would sign the divorce papers that very day. That he would take his check and leave my life. I made it clear that he would not fight it or hire attorneys, because we both knew he could not afford them and that he had no legal case. I told him that I would remove his mother from my house within a week and that he would never contact me again, except through my attorney and only for strictly legal matters. Richard had tears in his eyes. He began to beg, saying that our 35 years of marriage had to mean something. I looked at him without the slightest compassion. I told him they had meant 35 years of my life devoted to a man who never valued me. Most of my life was spent caring for an abusive mother-in-law while he cheated on me for who knows how long. That meant sacrificing my identity, my career, and my happiness for a family that never thanked me. So no, they did not mean what he thought they did. He said he had made a mistake. I replied that he had made many mistakes over many years and that now he would live with the consequences. I asked him to take the money he had earned honestly and build whatever life he wanted. Only that life would not include me. He signed the papers. He had no other option. He took his check and walked out of my office like a completely defeated man. I watched him leave without feeling absolutely anything. No joy, no sadness. Only a deep sense of relief. That same afternoon, Mrs. Margaret received the eviction notice. She had 7 days to leave my house. She called screaming, insulting, threatening. I calmly told her she could leave peacefully or she could be escorted out by the police. It was her choice. She chose to leave peacefully. Richard had to find a small apartment where the two of them could live. With his check he could pay a few months of rent, but sooner or later he would have to go back to working for real. Not just traveling from city to city spending his wife's money. Mrs. Margaret would have to get used to a much more modest life. Without the privileges she had grown accustomed to, and without the beautiful house I had kept spotless for her. Sometimes I wonder if she ever regretted the way she treated me. Probably not. People like that do not feel regret, they only see themselves as victims. Melissa left Richard exactly 2 weeks after moving in with his mother. Apparently, a 68-year-old man with an elderly mother and little money was not as attractive as she had imagined. He tried to contact me several times after that. Messages asking for forgiveness, saying he had been a fool, that he needed me. I blocked his number. There was absolutely nothing he could say that I was interested in hearing. My attorney finalized the divorce in record time. There were no fights or scandals. A chapter of my life simply closed, one that should have ended many years earlier. And then I began to live. To truly live for the first time in decades. I hired a personal trainer and began taking care of my health. Not to look good for someone else, but to feel good with myself. I joined a travel group for older adults and traveled to Paris as Susan had suggested. I walked through the streets of Montmartre. I saw the tower illuminated at night. I drank coffee in small, charming bistros. In Rome, I tossed a coin into the Trevi fountain. In Barcelona, I admired the architecture of Gaudi. Every city and every experience reminded me of everything I had missed while locked inside that house. But I did not only travel. I also devoted more time to my company. Without the burden of caring for Mrs. Margaret or keeping Richard happy, I had energy and time for new projects. I opened a mentorship program for young women entrepreneurs. I wanted to help other women avoid the mistakes I had made. To not lose their identity within a marriage. To not sacrifice their dreams for people who would never value them. The stories I heard broke my heart. Brilliant women shrinking themselves so their partners could feel bigger. Talented women abandoning their careers to care for families that treated them like servants. I told them not to be like me. Not to wait 35 years to value themselves. To do it now. I also reconnected with old friends, the ones I had stopped seeing because Richard always had an excuse not to go out or because Mrs. Margaret needed something. They welcomed me with open arms. Some were divorced, others widowed, others happily married to men who truly valued them. We formed a group that met every week. We went out to dinner, to the movies, to art exhibitions. Simple things I had not done in decades. One of those friends, Linda, asked me one day if I missed being married. I thought about it honestly before answering. I told her no, that I did not miss that marriage, that it had been a prison disguised as commitment, that if one day I were to be with someone again, it would be with someone who saw me as an equal, not as an employee or a substitute mother, but that, truthfully, at that moment I was enjoying my freedom far too much to think about it. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely in control of my time, my decisions, and my life. I did not have to answer to anyone. I did not have to ask permission. I did not have to sacrifice what I wanted for what others needed. It was liberating in a way that is hard to describe. 6 months after the divorce, I ran into Richard by chance at a shopping mall. He was buying medication for his mother. He looked tired, aged, defeated. He tried to speak to me, but I greeted him politely and went on my way. I felt no satisfaction and no desire for revenge. I simply felt nothing. He was a stranger. Someone who had once been part of my life but no longer was. And that was how it should be. I later learned from others that Mrs. Margaret eventually had to move into a public nursing home, because Richard could not care for her and work at the same time. She was furious as always, but she had no alternative. He tried to hire nurses, but he could not afford them on his salary. The woman who had enjoyed every comfort in my house for years was now sharing a room with other elderly women in a public facility. A very small part of me felt a bit of pity for her. Very small. Mrs. Margaret had the chance to be kind, to be grateful, to treat me with respect. She chose the opposite for 30 years. These were the consequences of her own decisions. As for Melissa, I learned she had found another man. Another older man with money. Apparently, this time she had learned to check bank accounts before committing. For Melissa, Richard had been nothing more than a miscalculation, just as she had been for him. I thought they deserved each other. My company continued to grow. We opened offices in other cities and developed sustainable housing projects that received international recognition. I was no longer just the heir to a last name. I was Evelyn Harper, a businesswoman in my own right. I began giving interviews to business magazines. I participated in panels on female leadership. I was even invited to speak at an international leadership forum about reinventing yourself after 60. In that talk, I shared my story. Not every detail, but enough. I spoke about how I lost my identity within a marriage and how I woke up decades later to realize that I had built professional success while neglecting my personal life. I spoke about how it is never too late to reclaim your power and decide that you deserve more. The video of that talk went viral. I received thousands of messages from women thanking me for sharing my experience. Women living in similar situations who found the strength to change their lives. Young women who decided not to lose their identity in their relationships. That was when I understood that my experience, as painful as it had been, had a greater purpose. Now, 1 year after the divorce, I live in a new house that I designed myself. It is smaller than the previous one, but completely mine. Filled with light and things I love. I have a garden where I grow flowers and vegetables. I adopted 2 cats who keep me company, asking for nothing more than food and a bit of affection. My mornings begin with yoga and coffee on the terrace. My days are filled with work that I am passionate about. Meetings with interesting people and projects that truly make a difference. I spend my evenings reading, watching movies I choose, or going out with friends. There is no one criticizing what I cook, how I dress, or how I organize my time. A few weeks ago, during a charity dinner, I met an interesting man. He was an architect, a widower, 70 years old. We talked about design, travel, and books. He asked for my number. I gave it to him, but made it clear that I was not looking for anything serious. Just occasional companionship, if anything. He smiled and said that sounded perfect because he also did not want to complicate his life at his age. We have gone out to dinner a couple of times. It is nice to have deep conversations with someone, but I am in no rush. I do not need a man to feel complete. I already am. That is, perhaps, the most important lesson I learned from all of this. I spent 35 years believing that my worth was found in being a good wife and a good daughter-in-law, in sacrificing myself for others. But my value was always within me. In my intelligence, my effort, and my ability to build and create. I did not need Richard to validate me, nor did I need Mrs. Margaret to appreciate me. My worth never depended on them. I wish I had understood that sooner. I wish the Evelyn of 33 had been as strong as the Evelyn of 68. But I cannot change the past. I can only live in the present and build the future. And that is exactly what I am doing. To the women who are listening to my story and see themselves reflected in it, I say this. Do not wait. Do not wait for him to change, for her to appreciate you, for everything to magically improve. If they do not value you now, they will not value you later. If you have to make yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger, that is not your place. Recognize your worth. Build your own resources and your independence. Do not give away all your power hoping someone will treat you well. People treat you the way you allow them to treat you. I allowed decades of mistreatment because I believed that was what a good wife was supposed to do. I was wrong. Marriage requires commitment and sacrifice, yes, but it must be mutual. Both people must respect and value each other. If only one person sacrifices while the other takes advantage, that is not a marriage. It is exploitation. And there is always time to choose differently. I did it at 68. I left a marriage of 35 years. I reclaimed my identity. I built a new life. If I could do it, you can too. It does not matter how old you are or how much time you have invested. Your life belongs to you and you only have one. Do not waste it being a smaller version of yourself to please others. Be the full, strong, authentic version you deserve to be. The day I signed the divorce papers, Laura asked me how I felt. I told her it felt as if I had been holding my breath for 35 years and could finally exhale. That is exactly how I feel. Now I breathe freely. Now I live fully. Now I am completely myself. Richard, Mrs. Margaret, and Melissa are nothing more than characters in a closed chapter of my story. A chapter that left me valuable lessons, but one that is over. The new chapters belong to me. I will write them however I choose. And believe me, they will be spectacular because now I know who I am, I know my worth, and I know exactly what I deserve. I will never settle for less again. Thank you for showing me exactly who you were. Thank you for freeing me from a life that was consuming me. Thank you for being so predictable and clumsy that you made the divorce simple. Thank you for underestimating me so deeply that you never saw what was coming. And to Mrs. Margaret, who treated me like a servant for 30 years, I also say thank you. Thank you for teaching me that no matter how much you sacrifice for someone who does not want to see you, it will never be enough. Thank you for showing me that some people simply do not have the capacity to value others. Thank you for making me so strong that when I finally decided to leave, nothing could stop me. As for Melissa, I do not even need to say anything to her. Her own greed and superficiality led her exactly where she belonged. She kept searching for her Prince Charming among older men with full wallets, without realizing that what she truly needed was to work on herself. I do not feel sorry for her. Everyone builds their own path. But above all, I thank myself. Thank you, Evelyn, for being strong all those years, even when you did not feel strong. Thank you for managing so well the money you inherited from your father. Thank you for never completely losing your identity, for keeping that part of yourself alive, even when it was hidden. Thank you for having, in the end, the courage to step out of the shadows and claim your place. Thank you for choosing yourself. Now at last I have plans. I am going to open a foundation for women who are victims of economic abuse. That silent form of violence where control is exercised through money. I want to help other women build their financial independence. I want to make sure that other women like me do not have to wait until 68 to discover their power. I'm also going to write a book. The full story uncensored. Not for revenge but to inspire. So that other women read it and say, if she could do it, so can I. And I'm going to keep traveling. I have a list of 20 countries I want to visit before I turn 75. I will visit every single one of them. I will dance tango in Buenos Aires, watch the northern lights in Iceland, and walk along the Great Wall in China. I am going to live every experience I denied myself for decades. I am going to take my company to levels I have not even imagined yet. I am going to create jobs, develop communities, and make a real impact on the world. I am not just going to exist. I am going to leave a mark. And if along the way I meet someone truly worth it, someone who sees me as an equal, who respects my independence and adds to my life instead of taking away from it, then maybe, just maybe, I will consider sharing part of my life. But it will be on my terms. I will never again sacrifice who I am for who someone else needs me to be. This is the story of a woman who lost 35 years but found the rest of her life. The story of a woman who was underestimated and proved what she was made of. A woman who fell but rose stronger than ever. What would you do in my place? Have you lived something similar? Do you know someone who needs to hear this story? Leave it in the comments and share your experience because these stories need to be told. We need to talk about these issues that were kept silent for so long. We need to support one another, we as women who have been underestimated, taken advantage of, and made invisible. And to the men who are listening, I hope this story makes you reflect on how you treat your partners, how you value the sacrifices others make for you, and the importance of mutual respect in any relationship. Do not be like Richard. Do not assume someone will always be there no matter how you treat them. Do not take for granted the people you love. Do not wake up one day to discover that what you thought you had was never truly yours. Because in the end, this is not just a story about divorce or revenge. It is a story about knowing your worth, setting boundaries, choosing yourself, and understanding that it is always possible to begin a new chapter. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 68 years old. I am a businesswoman, a philanthropist, a mentor, and a survivor. But above all, I am a free woman. And that freedom is worth more than all the years I lost searching for it. If my story inspired you, if it made you think, if it gave you the strength to make a change in your own life, then it was worth sharing. Remember this, you matter. Your dreams matter. Your happiness matters. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Do not allow anyone to make you small. Take up your space, claim your power, and live your life because it is yours and you only get one chance to live it. Do not waste it being less than you are to make someone happy who will never value you. Be completely yourself. Fully yourself. Authentically yourself. Everything else will find its place. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss new stories.